Greetings, everyone. I want to welcome you to this webcast. My name is Peter Young. I'm a Committee 100 member, and I also happen to be chair of the Committee 100 Asian American Curriculum is part. This webinar is the third in a series of events convened by the Committee 100 that are examining the challenges that are facing Chinese Americans and Asian Americans with regard to barriers to advancement in a wide variety of professions in the United States. And what is our goal? Well, our goal of this initiative is to contribute to the already significant efforts of organizations and individuals who've been tackling this issue in many different ways. In fact, I want to recognize a couple of them, and in fact, some of them are actually have registered for this webcast. Organizations such as Ascend, OCA, LEAP, the Asian American Government Executives Network. These are just a few of the many organizations that are each trying to tackle or to deal with this issue in different ways, whether it's training or education or otherwise. And my hat's off to them. And the whole idea here is to enhance what is already being done and to help educate and galvanize people to action. So now I do want to say, though, that probably many of you know about the Committee of 100, but for those who don't, I just want to summarize what we do. The Committee of 100 is a nonprofit, nonpartisan leadership organization made up of prominent Chinese Americans in a wide variety of professions in business, government, academia, and the arts. And it was founded 31 years ago by a group of extraordinary individuals, including I.M. Pei, who is, of course, the famous architect. The purpose of the Committee 100 is to promote leadership, provide leadership, and act as a constructive force in the two dual missions. One, to promote the participation of Chinese Americans in American society and acting as a public policy resource for Chinese American community, of which this is part of that. And the other is to act in a constructive dialogue and relationships, advancing it between peoples and leaders of the United States and China, which has always been a challenge, but is an even bigger challenge today. So those are the two missions, and it's a group of really very interesting and diverse Chinese Americans. If you want more information, just go to committee100.org. So the last thing I want to do before we go into this program is really just talk about upcoming events. There'll be a series of conferences and webcasts. There are two that I want to mention. One is not part of this program, but I want to mention, and that is we're going to have a remembrance for I.M. Pei that will be on May 20th, May 16th at 1 o'clock. It's remembering I.M. Pei on the 1-year anniversary of his passing. He was an extraordinary architect. He was an extraordinary person in many respects, but he also happened to be one of the founders of the Committee 100. And we'll be sending a link for that for those of you who have registered for this one, so that you can watch that 20-minute tribute to him. The other is the fourth in this series, and that will be on May 27th at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. And that's going to focus a fireside chat about lessons learned from two women pioneers in law, investment banking, university, Anla Chen and Alice Young. And again, focused on what are the obstacles and challenges for advancement in those professions, and also in particularly for women. So how are we going to do this? Well, first of all, Gary Locke, who is quite well known, so I don't have to give a long introduction. He is not only a Committee 100 member, but he also was the former governor of Washington State. He was Secretary of Commerce and also Ambassador to China from the United States. So he has had the privilege of not only being in elective office, but also an appointed position, which is terrific. He will try to address both. what we're going to do is we're going to have a fireside chat where I'll pose some questions to Gary, and then we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. For those of you who are listening, there are two ways that you can ask questions. One, you'll notice there's a chat function, and all you have to do is, everyone's quite familiar with chat functions, just type in your question, and Gary and I'll be able to see it. There's also a Q&A function, which is very similar to the chat function, which also that we can see, and we'll be able to see your questions. So with that, Gary, just a comment. You know, to start, you know, Asian Americans have been severely underrepresented historically when it comes to elective office and appointed government offices in the United States, with the exception of actually the place where I grew up, which is Hawaii, because 40% of the population were Asian Americans. So it was actually hard not to be elected if you were Asian American. So what I'd like to do is maybe divide this fireside chat into a couple of sections, but maybe start out with sort of your personal history, which is, you know, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your upbringing, but then how you ended up first going into government.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Peter, for hosting this and moderating, but also the other panels that you've been putting on and will continue to put on. And thank the Committee of 100 for sponsoring this, as well as some of the other Asian American, Chinese American organizations that are participating and getting the word out. I guess we have a lot of people signed up, and for those on the East Coast, this is 8 o'clock in the evening, and so you must not have much else to do. But anyway, thank you very much, Peter, for hosting this, and it's great to be with all of you. It's a very important topic, political representation, participation in government, whether you're Democrat or Republican. Given the tumultuous times that we're in, with a lot of backlash against Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans because of the coronavirus and the stigmatization, the stereotyping that's going on, as well as just the rhetoric against China, which crops up every presidential election. And I think the impact that it has on Chinese Americans here in the United States. Now, I grew up in Seattle, born and raised in Seattle, lived in public housing for the first few years of my life, because it was really public housing for university students and returning veterans from World War II. My dad served in the United States Army, was part of the Normandy invasion, D-Day, plus I think two or 3 days. Was in the armored division and was part of the group of American GIs that were rushing to Berlin to try to beat the Russians to Berlin. And my son and I, a few months ago, watched that TV series Band of Brothers, and so many of the vicious battles, from the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes, and everything else. Those were the battles and the campaigns that my dad was involved in. So it was really interesting to see that. Dad never really talked about it, like many of the people who served in World War II.
Well, I'm sure he had a big influence on you in terms of serving country, right?
Yes, I mean, he was very always volunteering to the community and trying to give back by way of service or volunteering in the church and everything else. And so then I learned English about the same time that my mom was learning English to become a United States citizen, because after the war was over, Dad went back to Hong Kong, met my mom, they got married, and he brought her back home to Seattle, where he had come when he was about 12 or 13 years old. So you know, they had a grocery store, they had a restaurant, a grocery store, and they impressed upon us, all three of the kids, that we all had to work hard. We had to take care of each other, support the family, look after each other, and we had to get a college education. And so, like you and your sister, I ended up at Yale, knew nothing about Yale, and I was a product of affirmative action at the time. They were hoping for more students from the public schools, more students from the West Coast, and students of color. And so I consider myself a threefer.
When I went through, they had a quota on Asian Americans.
Yeah, and I consider myself a threefer. And so, but you know, I did well. Then went to law school, came back home, worked in the King County Prosecutor's Office, prosecuting people for murder, robbery, assaults, and other complex crimes. And then I volunteered for the state legislature one year. I was getting burned out from the prosecutor's office, left, got a chance to work in the Washington State Legislature as a lawyer for the Higher Education Committee. And I was also the editor of all the documents and the briefing papers that all the senators received on all the legislation that they might be voting on that day. So it gave me a glimpse of all the issues that the elected officials were dealing with. And I came to realize that there were some really hardworking people, and average people, people from all walks of life, whether they were accountants, dentists, barbers, hairdressers, tree farmers, teachers, and just all professions. And so I finally decided, hey, I care about a lot of these issues, and if they can do it, why not me? And so a few years later, I ran for the state legislature. It was a hotly contested primary because it's a solidly Democratic district. And I was running against a Democratic incumbent who had been there for 10, 12 years, had the support of all the interest groups, got all the money, and we had nothing. So I just had a small band of volunteers who supported me. And all I did was doorbell, 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 ripped a couple of pants from the dogs that bit me, lost a lot of weight, just knocking on doors every single day. And I won the primary against all odds. And because it's a solidly Democratic district, I got like 80, 90% of the vote in every election after that.
Were there at that time from Washington State, were there very many people, Asian Americans, who run for office, or were
no
at the time?
No, just a few in the once in a while with the Seattle City Council.
Yeah.
And there was a trailblazer many years before me, a guy named Wing Luke, who was the first real Asian American, Chinese American elected to a city council of a major city. He tragically died in a plane crash, and he could have gone so far, and his life was cut so short. And then from time to time, we've had some Asian Americans on the Seattle City Council, one at one time, and maybe several years later another. We had perhaps only 2 or 3 Asian Americans ever serving in the state legislature. And so when I was finally elected, there was another person from another city south of Seattle. He and I were the only Asian Americans in the state legislature. Very few minorities at all, very few African Americans, no Hispanic.
When you first ran, was there a lot of pushback at all, the fact that you were Asian American? I mean,
no, not at all, because I represented a district that was very multi-ethnic, large population, African Americans, Asian Americans, also huge disparity in income from very low income to some of the wealthiest parts of the Seattle area, and a lot of blue collar. And I think that because we were such a ethnically diverse area, that there was no issue about me running. So
you went into legislature and so forth, and then I gather you must have liked it because you kept on going, right?
Well, I realized that I could be on all these different policy committees, but unless there's the money to implement some of these programs, whether it's financial aid or more support for colleges and universities, or human service programs and assistance for immigrant families, passing policy without money doesn't really make much sense. And so I got onto the budget writing committee, and then I realized, hey, it's the chairman of the committee that really writes the budget on behalf of the state legislature, right, and negotiates with the Republicans. So I said, well, I want to be that person. So I got to be chairman eventually of the budget writing committee, did that for many years. And then I also said, and I had kind of an internal term limit in my mind, no more than 12 years. And then an opportunity came up to run for King County Executive. And I was encouraged by many people to run. The incumbent Republican had served 2 terms, was running for a 3rd term. He had no primary challenger. And there were 5 of us Democrats, who are all good friends, running against each other, spending all of our money. So, and I happened to win the primary. And the day after the primary, there was 0 money in the bank, only 6 weeks to go before the November election, because our primaries were in mid-September. And all the TV stations want cash before they'll even reserve the time for you. So we had only about 4 weeks to raise all the money for the general election. I won and was King County Executive for several years. And then suddenly our Democratic governor announced that he was not going to be seeking a 2nd term. And then there was a huge flood of candidates on the Democratic side to run for governor. Some good friends of mine were running. And then about 8 Republicans. And some of them were very, very good friends of mine. In fact, my former boss, who hired me when I was a prosecutor, and then who was actually the county attorney, who was actually technically my lawyer as King County executive. And a good friend of mine on the Democratic side, Mayor Norm Rice, he and I were always having these weekly meetings on city-county cooperation. And then at night, we're running against each other for the Democratic primary. But I won that Democratic primary. And let me just say one thing about that Democratic primary, or the primary in general. In Washington State, you get to vote for anyone. You don't register by party. You vote for, let's say, a Democrat for governor on the primary, and you flip the page and you can vote for a Republican for lieutenant governor, or a socialist for secretary of state. And the highest vote getters of each party advance to the final election. And so all 13 candidates running for governor, 8 Republicans and 5 Democrats, were lumped together. Mayor Norm Rice, African American, and I combined got over 41% of the total vote in the state of Washington. And so I was very proud of that the whole state was willing to accept 2 people of color in such a dramatic fashion. But because I had so many more votes than Norm Rice, I advanced to the general election and squared off against a Republican who had only gotten like 12% of the total vote in the primary. So, and then we won, and the rest was history.
Is there any comments on maybe why you were successful at that time? Because these were early days, right? And was there anything special about Washington State, or was there just something where there were a combination of, you know, what your beliefs were and your track record that appealed to people? I mean, what were the things that really, because it sounds like it was clearly very, very competitive, right?
Oh my gosh, it was very hotly contested on the Democratic side, and I think I won with about, I think I had about 23% of the vote in the total 23% of the total vote in the primary. Mayor Norm Rice got about 18% of the vote, and like I said, the closest Republican had only about 12%. So she advanced to the final, and because I had more votes than Mayor Norm Rice, I advanced to the final. The campaign was just introducing myself, our family history, our family story, basically saying, yeah, I'm a son of immigrants, but it really has helped shape my values. And I think my values are very much in line with everyday people. We all want a good education for our kids. We want job security. We want good paying jobs. We want a nice, clean environment. And we want public safety. And so those are the themes that I focused on. But I wanted people in many parts of the state who did not know me to get to know our family history. And so I just emphasized those things. And I think it resonated. And basically said that a lot of the concerns that I and our family have are the same concerns that you have. I think that's what makes for successful candidates for office. The public wants to know that you understand what their issues are, what they're worried about, what their dreams and aspirations are, and that your values are aligned with theirs. You may not have all the solutions, and they may not agree with all your positions, but they want to know that they can look you in the eye, and that you appear to be a decent person and a person of similar background, or at least aspirations, as them.
Well, it certainly was true that you weren't born with a silver spoon in your mouth, and so, you know, it's not like you were a rich person suddenly wanting to run for office or whatever. So I think that, I suspect that was very helpful, because people felt in touch with you as a person, right? Given your background, right?
Yeah, and that's that's basically the electorate, blue collar, middle class,
Yeah.
believing in the American dream, and I basically said that our family is a proof of the American dream. And I constantly emphasize that we're all immigrants or foreigners, except for the Native Americans. We're all foreigners, whether we're first generation or 10th generation, and each group has contributed to the success and the prosperity of the state of Washington, and that I wanted to continue that.
Now, there must have been a big change, though, between being in the legislature and so forth, and then being governor. I mean, probably a huge change. I mean, we're now all witnessing close up the importance of governors of different states. So how was that transition, for you? It must have been quite a transition, right? In terms of what it felt like, right? And the responsibilities, et cetera.
Well, I had a little bit of training when I moved from the state legislature to the county executive. The county executive is an elected position, one of the few county administrators in the state of Washington that is elected. And as county executive, I'm in charge of the jails, I'm in charge of the bus system, the sewage treatment, the mental health systems, the courts, the parks and recreation, county roads. So it was a real executive management position, even though it was elected. And that really gave me a taste for management. And one thing that I learned in the state legislature is that legislators set policy and they set the overall framework, but how the executive branch executes and implements a program can make all the difference between failure, mediocrity, or great success. And I saw how some of the programs that I really cared about and helped fund with Democrats and Republicans in the legislature were not being well implemented at the executive branch. And so I said, I want to get into the executive branch and help shape and actually implement those policies. And there's so much latitude. I mean, the legislature can say, here's money to do this, but how you execute and implement can make all the difference. And so I really wanted to get into that. And so it was easy from moving from county executive to the governor's office, and given my familiarity with the legislature and the workings of state government, given all my years in the legislature.
Yeah, because the government job really is like a COO or CEO job, essentially, right? When you really think about it, right?
Well, you hire a lot of department heads, whether it's running the prisons, running the lottery, or the pension system, the health department, human services, unemployment insurance programs, to just government buildings and things like that, to job training and retraining programs. And the key is hiring good people, really good people, giving them latitude, giving them clear priorities and objectives, holding them accountable, but supporting them as well. And I'm really proud of the fact that as governor, I had perhaps the most diverse cabinet in state history. And I went out of my way to find people who did not fit the traditional mold, people who didn't have background or experience in a particular field, whether it was tax collections for the state or running the lottery or things like that. I just wanted people who were smart, of integrity, go-getters, bright, and creative, and perhaps even risk takers. Because I think too much in government, and that's my version of affirmative action. It's never been to hire or to accept people who are unqualified, but really to take a hard look at people you might not otherwise consider. I was a product of affirmative action. I mean, Yale reached out to students from the public schools or from the West Coast, or people of color, people that were not the traditional applicant to Yale. But we still had to take the same exams and write the same papers, and we succeeded. And that's what I think we need in government and in all positions, even corporate America. Don't just look at the people with a traditional resume or background. Find people who are smart, creative, give them a chance. And I'm really proud that our department heads led their departments and agencies to national prominence. So many of them were rated the very best in America.
Now, then you made this transition, and many people get to go up to being governor and so forth, but they never go beyond that. And not because they couldn't, and sometimes they choose not to, but a lot of things. The transition to a national position, right, and appointed, that's pretty dramatic, and not that many people go through that. And so you ended up going from governor to serving as the Commerce Secretary at the national level, and then later ambassador. Tell us a little bit about that, but also what were the, it couldn't have been easy, right? What were the obstacles? I suspect some obstacles maybe unrelated to your being Asian American, right? There may be others, and political issues and so forth, but others might be. I mean, could you sort of say what were the things that were impeding you, right? And were some of them being Asian Americans, but were there other things that helped you to essentially go on to national office?
Well, after the governorship, I went to work for a private law firm for about 4 years, and that was the time under President Bush, and then of course Senator Barack Obama was running for president, along with former First Lady Hillary Clinton, U.S. Senator Hillary Clinton. First of all, I never expected and thought I could ever join the Obama administration. Why? Because I was one of the Washington State co-chairs for Hillary Clinton.
Ah, okay.
Right, and Senator Obama called me one time on a Saturday morning and said, "Hey, Gary, I've heard a lot about you. I could really use your help on the campaign, and why don't you come and support me?" And I said, Senator, this was like in March or April, I said, the way things are going, I think you're going to win the nomination, but I'm a co-chair of Senator Clinton's campaign for president here in the state of Washington. The Clintons have just been so supportive and helpful to me all the years that I was governor, and I just can't. And I said, but the way things are going, I think you're going to get all the delegates, and the day that you wrap up the delegates, and it's apparent that you have the nomination, you can count on me to support you 100%. And so the day in which he crossed the threshold of delegates, and Senator Clinton acknowledged that he was the presumptive nominee, then I jumped in and helped on the campaign, and went to several states to campaign for Barack Obama. And then of course he won, but I still did not ever expect to get a call to come and meet with the president-elect about serving in his administration. But what was really helpful is that we had a network of active Asian Americans in the Democratic Party who have long been supporters of and workers in the party, many who supported Barack Obama at the very, very beginning. And so they were feeding my name to the transition committee and all the different groups that were looking at people to fill out the administration. So I really owe so much to so many of them. And that's why it's so important for all Asian Americans and Chinese Americans to be active in politics. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you can still have an influence on the people that eventually serve in the administration. And I was just so lucky. And I was so proud to serve in the Obama administration because we actually had 3 Asian Americans, 2 Chinese Americans as cabinet secretaries. I think it's the most diverse cabinet in U.S. history, and especially if you also look at the deputy secretaries and some of the other ranks just below. We had General Eric Shinseki, who was the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. We had Secretary Steve Chu of the Department of Energy, and then I was the Secretary of Commerce. And then you also had people like Chris Liu, who was initially what we called the Cabinet Secretary in the White House, who's the real White House interface with all the cabinet secretaries. And we had people like Pete Rouse with a Japanese American ancestry, who at one point was the chief of staff for President Obama. And then Chris Liu, of course, ended up being Deputy Secretary of Labor. So, you have to really compliment President Obama for his commitment to diversity.
In a number of these webcasts, one of the comments that has come up every time is that people say, it's very important to be talented, and it's very important to be hardworking and respected, but a huge part is mentorship. Do you feel that was the case? And do you think were mentors an important part of your success, but also an important part of breaking through these kind of American career barriers?
Well, certainly for me, when I first ran for state legislature against a Democratic incumbent who had the backing of all the interest groups, because she had a decent voting track record. And the way politics goes is that if the interest groups are happy with your voting record, they're always going to support you, regardless of the quality and the credentials of a challenger, because you want you want legislators and politicians to know that if they are supportive of your issues, you will support them in the future. And so she had the support of the teachers, the firefighters, the police officers, state employees, and things like that, and raised a lot of money. But she did not doorbell, and I did. And so I established that eye-to-eye contact with the voters and said, hey, we can do better. She's a great legislator, but we can do better. And I won. But over the next several years, and even during that campaign, I had an incredible mentor, a woman who had served as the receptionist for a former governor, a Republican governor. She was the personal secretary, executive assistant to several elected officials. And she was kind of like, I mean, one former governor described her as the most pivotal woman in Washington state politics, because anybody who wanted to run for office had to go pay a visit to Ruth Wu. And she had an incredible mind.
She was like Richelieu, the power behind the throne, right?
You got it. Power behind so many elected officials. But she had an encyclopedic memory. She knew each legislator and their legislative district number. I could never even remember the district numbers in the city of Seattle, but she was amazing, and she was my guiding force, my mentor, my second mother, critiquing me, prodding me, and really
telling you some things you didn't want to hear at times, right?
Yep. Oh yeah. I mean, she sat me down and chewed me out from time to time, but it was always feeding me names of people to look out for, to help up and coming people, because she had mentored me, she helped push me to mentor other people and to give them a chance. Just as people took a chance on me, I felt I needed to also give to take chances on other people.
Yeah. I want to switch gears. And by the way, my own personal experience is very similar to yours in a different profession, but it really, you really have to decide what you love and but also if you're good at it, right? Because if you love something but you're not good at it, but also manage transitions. I mean, for you coming from not a wealthy family in Washington, coming to Yale and so forth, that was a big change. I got to tell you, I grew up in Hawaii. Going from Hawaii to New Haven is a really big change, right? Especially my father was a professor, so there were no school tours. So, I got there and they said, wow, it's really cold here, But let's take the big picture and say, let's look at Asian Americans as a group. I think there's some people, let me throw out some comments that people make. There are people who say, well, there's discrimination. There's also, sort of the distribution of the population. But some people also say that part of the reason there aren't as many Asian Americans and Chinese Americans is self-created, right? That, more the ethic of, study hard and, go to medical, whatever it is, and succeed, but the orientation not being to be in politics. Maybe if you can step back and say, what do you think are the 3 or 4 things that you think that impede the progress of Asian Americans being fairly represented population-wise, in politics?
Well, I'm looking down on my some stats here, and Asian Americans make up about 5.5% of the U.S. population, but less than 3% in the United States Congress. Mm-hmm. New York City, where you are, population Asian Americans is almost 12% Asian Americans in New York City, but only 4% of the New York City Council are Asian American. San Francisco has done pretty well, pretty much parity, where they have about 33% of the population, 34% Asian American, and 34%, 36% of the Board of Supervisors, their city council, are Asian American. So, I think we still have a long ways to go, and maybe it's because so many of us think that politics is not an honorable profession, and we're still under the influence of our parents who say, go into the tech industry, be an engineer, be a doctor or a scientist or something like that, or even an academician. But I think that if we really care about the issues around us, whether it's education, public safety, public health, jobs, climate change, the environment, income inequality, we need to be at the table helping set the policies that affect all of us. We can't just leave it to someone else.
Yeah.
You know, Asian Americans and Chinese Americans have given their blood, sweat, and tears for this country. Building the railroad, finishing the transcontinental railroad, working in all the lumber and the lumber and the canneries on the West Coast, serving in world conflicts in our armed forces, creating some of the cures and the medicines to fight AIDS, and the list goes on and on and on. And we've excelled in the arts, but we need to think about governance as well. And I think that also, I think that we've been held back because sometimes we've not been politically active and involved. And so if you suddenly decide to run for office, it's a little bit harder if the community has not seen the participation of Asian Americans. And it's not that you have to start off running for mayor or governor or the county executive. Serving on boards and commissions.
Yeah.
Volunteering on campaigns, running for the school board. I mean, that is perhaps one of the most important elected positions in America, deciding the fate and the quality of our schools, which impact the education for all of us. And I've always said that education is a great equalizer in our society. Well, it all starts at the public school level, and that's where we really need to. All of us need to just be more involved in politics, even from campaigning. And then those governors and those mayors, when they get elected, will appoint AAPIs to some of these commissions, and that's how we can start to bring our perspective and our lived experiences and the experiences of our community members to the table to help improve the discussion, bring new viewpoints, and ultimately have better public policy that's formulated.
Yeah, and I happen to agree with you that, you know, it's really a mixture of reasons, and some of them are societal, right? Discrimination or stereotyping and so forth. I mean, there's no question that there are unfair stereotypes about Asian Americans in this country. Some helpful, some not helpful. But I think part of it is what you talk about, which is their cultural bias against politics among Asian families, and where you ought to put your energies. And I don't think it's because Asian Americans don't want to contribute. I think they do. It's just they're not. You know, the parents don't aim people towards politics as a way of contributing, as opposed to contributing other ways. But I think that's changing, and I think part of it, as each generation goes by, I mean, your parents and my parents were the same generation, right? And you know, there are certain biases, right, that existed at the time, right? Now,
but it is changing. It is changing, and we're seeing more and more AAPIs elected. And it really takes, you know, that first person to run, whether it's in Minnesota or Boston or Washington State or blazing the trail in New York City. And the more that we have running, and once they get elected, they can serve as a role model and kind of break the novelty or the glass ceiling and make it possible for more to run. That's what I always did when I was governor. I mean, there were so many groups across the United States that invited Mona and me to attend a banquet, to receive an award, to be recognized. And we could have been gone every single weekend all around the country receiving these awards and recognition. But we said no to virtually every single one, because I did not want criticism that I was neglecting the state, number one, and number two, just you know, full of myself. But number three, I really felt that if I was an effective, respected governor in the state of Washington, I could do more to inspire and make it easier for Asian Americans to not only run for office, but actually win. That if I did a very bad job, that would create a bad reputation, and that would, unfortunately, non-Asians, non-minorities, people, I mean, they can screw up, but it doesn't stop anyone else, Caucasians, from running for office. But if a person of color messes up, for some reason we're held to a higher standard, and it kind of, there's a backlash, and it has negative repercussions on anyone else who might run for office. Just as I benefited from the excellent work and the good reputation of others in the state of Washington who served on the city council or the state legislature. If I did a good job, people would say, yeah, you're running for office. Oh yeah, I remember Gary Locke. He was a good governor. He was a good county executive. Yeah, I mean, they're more open to Asian Americans running for office. And I think that we're beginning to see that with more and more Asian Americans in the Congress, in local politics from every corner of the country.
Yeah, and actually the thing that was really a surprise to me is that in spite of the fact that the increase in the negative, press about Asian Americans in this country and Chinese Americans in the current environment, it was refreshing to see Andrew Yang, run for president and get as much support as he did. I mean, I think that was probably a big surprise to me, because I felt the environment was more negative about Asian Americans than it was 4 or 5 years ago.
If we have really good candidates, if we have exciting candidates who talk about the issues that everyday people care about, then we can break through some of the stereotypes and the biases against Asian Americans. You can't eliminate it all. Even when I was running for office, there was polling done that showed that some people would never vote for a person of color in the state of Washington. And I fear that some of the rhetoric, the divisive rhetoric that's coming out of Washington, D.C. and the White House right now is not helping. The China virus, the Gung flu virus, the Wuhan virus, we're seeing acts of discrimination, racism, hostility against all Asian Americans. I mean, again, we're all lumped together, Oh, we're not, you're Asian American. Well, you're to blame for the coronavirus, even though you're not of Chinese ancestry or ethnicity. We're all lumped together. And like the Trump campaign ad accusing Vice President Biden of being too chummy with Chinese government officials, they included a picture of me as one of those Chinese government officials.
Right.
Well, hey.
That was pretty outrageous.
Well, again, it just kind of, you're Asian American, therefore you're Chinese American, therefore, you must be loyal to the land of your ancestors. You're Japanese American, well, obviously you're loyal to the emperor, and that's why we have to round you up and incarcerate you and intern you during World War II, even though the sons, the young men, volunteered and became the most decorated military unit in U.S. history, and served as intelligence officers and infantrymen. So, those stereotypes keep persisting, and it's aggravating, it's outrageous, but in some ways not unexpected, given a lot of the words and the sentiments of this president attacking Muslims, Hispanics, and everyone else, and certainly Asian Americans.
Well, I think I think what part of what you're saying is, in the current environments, it's even more important for Asian Americans to be active in politics, because in fact, lots of things are happening that if you don't have some positive influence on trying to push back and demonstrate, there'll be a price to pay. And
just having a presence, a vocal presence on the cabinet of the president in the White House makes a difference. Right after the September 11th attack, Norma Netta, who was then Secretary of Transportation, talks about how in a cabinet meeting, how President Bush turned to Norma Netta and the other cabinet members and said that we got to make sure that there's no hostility and discrimination backlash against Muslim Americans the way there was against the Japanese during World War II. And that was because of the presence of Norma Netta. So having representation in the halls of power
Makes it
whether it's in the Congress, the state, cities, in the White House, makes a big difference.
You know, it's very interesting. I'll make two comments. One is, although it is important for people who are Asian American and people in this audience to consider serving in government, etc., I think it's also very important to support each other. And I think one of the unfortunate things about Asian American, Chinese Americans is there's intense loyalty to family, right? But there's a less of an inclination to donate to others or help others. It's just that someone on the first webcast said, one of the panelists said, you know, there's a tendency for Asian Americans to say, and rather than saying, I'm going to help you, I'll see you at the top of the mountain if you get there, right? And it's a little bit of that true. But I also think, so one, I think that all of us, even if you don't run for office or you don't, you need to support Asian Americans who are trying to, because without support, they can't succeed, right? And the other thing I want to say is, you know, we talk about internship of the Japanese during World War II, but you've got to remember, there was an Exclusion Act for a really long time that was very, very discriminatory against Chinese Americans. And I got to tell you, my first 9 years I lived in Virginia before we moved out, you know, to Hawaii and so forth. While I was there, it was against the law for an Asian American to marry a white. It was literally against the law. And I'm not 100 years old. So I think we should worry about the fact that it could head in that direction, and which would be harmful for all of us, right? Are there any, I guess, you know, we're never going to go through all the questions because we have 82 questions, so we're clearly not going to go through all of them. But to end this fireside chat part, you know, if you have any sort of comments about, you know, any advice or what lessons you think in the current environment, because obviously things are not the same today as they were when you first ran for office, so forth. Things have changed, you know, Twitter and all these other things. You know, what are the things, you know, what are the couple of things that you would like to convey to this audience as what's different today, and what does that mean in terms of things they should focus on in trying to be successful?
Well, number one, I think we need to be very proud of our ancestry and the contributions of Chinese Americans to the prosperity of America, starting from you know, finishing the transcontinental railroad to working in the gold mines and the lumber camps and the canneries, to our contributions in the armed forces, contributions in science and technology, and so many of the things that we take for granted in medicine and technology were created and invented by Chinese Americans, to the arts, to our culture. It is now a very integral part of American life. And that we need to remember that just as our ancestors and our parents were discriminated against, we need to make sure that other immigrant groups and people coming to America are also not discriminated against. We cannot just say, oh, we're somehow been successful, we've assimilated. But first of all, that's not really true. I mean, we're not the model minority, and there's a lot of challenges facing many segments of the Asian American community, but even within the Chinese community and the Chinese elderly and so forth. We cannot rest on our laurels and say that we have achieved it, and anyone else coming into America, that's their tough luck. Because discrimination against them, as we've seen, whether it's against Muslim Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, easily can turn against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, as we're now seeing in the backlash against and the concern over the coronavirus. And tensions with China will increase. Growing frustration among Democrats and Republicans and among the business community and the Congress with the trade and economic and human rights policies, rule of law policies of China. We need to make sure that Chinese Americans and Asian Americans are not caught in the crossfire of the tensions between China and the United States. We need to make it very clear to the policymakers and the opinion makers that you can have huge disagreement and criticism of the policies of the Chinese government, but that should not spill over to the people of China or Chinese Americans. We can criticize all we want and take great umbrage with the policies and the actions of the government of China, but that's not Chinese Americans who are here. And so I really think that we need to be very politically active, and we need to speak out on some of these discriminatory, racist, insensitive, stereotype issues and comments, because if nobody speaks up, they will continue. And we also need to start forming alliances with other civil rights and civil liberty groups, whether it's the NAACP or the Jewish defense organizations and things like that, because we cannot expect to do it on our own.
Because this is not just, and it's not just an Asian American problem, right? Now we have a huge number of questions, but I want to select a few, right? Just one or two for the remainder of this. One question was this, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but how do you explain this sudden, the success that Andrew Yang had up to a point, right? What do you think that about his candidacy that struck a chord?
Well, I think he was talking, Andrew really should be on this and talk about what his campaign did. But he was energetic, he was dynamic, he was eloquent, and he had an energy about him. But more importantly, I think he was addressing the angst and the concerns of everyday working people who see the advent of technology, and he could speak from that viewpoint of being successful in technology, but talking about the disruption and the impact of technology to everyday people and blue-collar workers whose jobs would be taken away, eliminated, or reduced because of technology, and talking therefore about the need to supplement people's incomes. And so he was able to attract really Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals with his proposal of a universal income. And that may be a little bit ahead of time, and maybe the majority of the American public is not accepting that right now. But really, it's people are beginning to think about that. I mean, if with artificial intelligence and robotics, so many jobs are going to be eliminated, will there be jobs for our children? Will there be jobs for the people 10 years from now who are now 50 years old or 45 years old? I mean, are we expecting everybody to go back to college to take courses in coding when they're 55 years old? So I think he's starting to he's hitting a chord among people who are worried about their future and saying, they've worked all their lives, and maybe every person should be receiving a stipend from the government.
And he didn't run as an Asian American or Chinese American. He ran as a person with certain beliefs, and I think people related to that.
People of color can, in most districts or most parts of the country, cannot just run as a person of color. When I ran for the state legislature, I mean, the Asian American population was maybe only about 20% in my district. Not everyone was a U.S. citizen and could vote, so you just can't count on that block, whether it's African American, Hispanic, Asian American. They can be a crucial part. They can maybe put you over the edge and over the hump. But you've got to appeal to everyone, because once you're elected, you have to represent the huge diversity of your constituents. And while they may have different issues, and I was able to use and draw upon my immigrant experience to improve policies and legislation in Olympia, in the state capitol, or even as governor. But I have to represent everyone. And a lot of the issues are common to everyone. Safe streets, good paying jobs, quality education.
Yeah. There are a lot of interesting comments here, by the way. One of which is, the two of you look really good. So I really like that comment there, but it wasn't a question.
They talk about you?
Well, obviously, they're not looking closely, right? But here's an interesting question, which is, can Governor Locke share his advice on how Chinese and Asian Americans can work more effectively as a political coalition to have more of an impact on the political system? How do we create more Gary Locke for America? I like the last.
Well, I think political power also involves funding campaigns, and the more that we can join together and have singular groups or that raise the money and then make contributions, the more influential Asian Americans and Chinese Americans can be. And there are a lot of these groups that are now forming to help channel and pool your money, and putting out policy statements and position papers representing the concerns of the Asian American political islander community. Just as Emily's list is a very powerful force, recommending candidates to support and to contribute to. I think we need similar type of organizations for the AAPI community, so that members of Congress, people running for city council or governor, they will value that endorsement by Asian Americans when they run for office, and making that recommendation that, oh, send in a $25 check to that candidate running in your neighboring state, and that person has good values, is sensitive to the issues of Asian Americans, and deserves our support. I think that it can be really, really effective in bringing Asian Americans together and giving Asian Americans more political clout.
Now, here's an interesting question. Somewhat that we have a lot of questions that are very similar and so forth, so I won't repeat those. Here's someone in the audience says, look, I'm a father of 2 kids. I want to know, I want some advice from Gary on how to, what advice to give to my kids with regard to leadership and their future. And you have kids, so obviously you could relate to this question, right?
Yeah, trying to raise kids is so hard, and each child has a totally different personality and interests and things like that. I think just having conversations with them about what's happening, conversations at the dinner table, making sure they turn off all their electronic devices and actually have conversation at the table, and talking about what's in the newspaper or what's happening at school and things like that, and just talking about some of the problems facing our society, our individual communities, and then really demonstrating and leading by example, being involved in the community, volunteering, whether it's a church, nonprofit group, arts group, whatever, environmental cleanup of the neighborhood, showing that we're involved, and a lot of it is, and involving the kids in some of those projects too, and certainly
setting an example is very, very important. I'm on the board of a lot of nonprofits. I'm president of one, unfortunately. And a lot of it is like anything, it's setting an example for your kids and then encouraging them to be involved. But a lot of the influence is what they see you do. And I think that's really important.
And that includes charitable giving too. Mona and I had a practice of giving back to the community monetarily and financially, and one time Mona was going on a trip to, I think, Central America to visit some impoverished areas, and our little daughter at that time was only about 5 years old, and gave Mona a bunch of her savings and said, "Mom, can you give this to the people who need help?" So just seeing their parents giving back, even financially, even a small amount, is developing that notion of sharing and investing and caring about others in the community. I think that's a great example of leadership and a way to help develop leadership and awareness.
Now, Gary, I am going to forward the 95 questions to you personally, just so you know what they were. But I have an ending question for you. So what's the next chapter?
I'm actually willing to go over time if we have more minutes. I'm willing to go go
Well,
longer. I feel bad that we haven't gotten to so many
well,
of
we
the
won't get
questions
through
of
the
the viewers.
94, that's for sure. But really, for you, what's the next chapter? I mean, you've had such a long history of involvement in government and in helping. Only small periods where you've, gone back to, to legal practice and so forth. What's the next chapter for you? And of course, part of the question is, what's the next chapter for this country politically also, right? But, any comments? But if your answer is no comment, I'll understand, right?
Well, first of all, I will be very active in the upcoming presidential campaign. I've already endorsed, no secret, Vice President Biden. And whether you're Democrat or Republican, you just got to get involved. And if you care about the issues, and if you're a Republican, then please speak out. I have so many friends that are Republicans who are trying to offer a more balanced approach and viewpoint to say the policies and the divisive words of President Trump do not reflect the Republican Party. We need more Republicans to stand up and say, while we may agree with the ultimate goal on policy X, Y, and Z, we are an inclusive party, and we value the diversity of the people of this country. I think that's what's really important, and that's what really concerns me. This growing income inequality, the haves versus the have-nots, this polarization by culture and ethnicity. I have been giving speeches for many, many, many years, and I keep saying that except for the Native Americans, we are all foreigners in this land. Whether we're first generation, 10th generation, whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower, a slave vessel from Africa, or a steamer from China. And each wave of groups of immigrants and foreigners have brought their culture, their perspectives, their language, their ideas, and it has led to the vitality, the dynamism, the energy, and the innovation of America. That's what really makes America great. And people who don't understand that diversity is our strength, generation after generation from all corners of the world, they're the ones who really don't understand what makes America truly great. So I would hope that we all embrace our diversity, our culture. When I was growing up, actually, I was rejecting my culture. I'm ashamed to admit this. We had a third grade teacher who every day asked us kids, and we had a lot of kids from immigrant families from the Philippines, from Japan, from China, even Italians. And the teacher would ask us every day what we had for breakfast. And if it was not the typical breakfast of ham and eggs, and for my mom, we made a lot of chiffon, or in Cantonese, made juk, with vegetables and meat and maybe fish in it. We had our hands slapped with a ruler. And so this teacher was trying to drive the culture out of each of her students. And so I came to reject.
Raisin Bran, right?
I came to reject and rebel against my native culture. And I saw on TV, these images of moms wearing pearl necklaces, wearing a dress, wearing high heels, vacuuming the floor. And I said, how come, Mom, you're not like the people on TV? So I caused a lot of grief for my parents. And it wasn't until the civil rights movement that I could really understand and accept my culture and realize that I could be both Chinese and American. I'm actually Chinese American. And that has really guided me all through my life. So that's something that I'm very, very concerned about. More directly, I'm actually right now a finalist to be a temporary interim president of a local college that is undergoing racial turmoil and strife. And so I might be doing that for a little while. So I love education. I've always had a passion for education.
It sounds like, Gary, you seem to gravitate towards really easy jobs, right? But, I would like to end with one comment. And those of you who will watch the 20-minute webcast on May 16th, on the first year anniversary of his passing, we will, my sister Alice Young will be the MC. She's also a Committee 100 member. But then we'll have a short video, 3.5-minute video, but also we'll have comments from Didi Pei, the son of I.M. Pei, who also is a Committee 100 member. But the reason why I brought up is I.M. Pei, he's in the film, and he says, I came to this country as a Chinese. I became a Chinese American, but I always will not forget that I'm Chinese, but I also won't forget I'm Chinese American. right? That I'm an American. And I thought that was a very powerful statement, which is essentially what you're saying, right? That they're not contradictory, right? You know, you have to remember your heritage, but you also have to, you know, recognize yourself as an American, and that's not, you know, that's not a contradiction.
Yeah, we as Chinese Americans, we can be so proud of the contributions of China over the centuries to world civilization, the inventions of the compass, the clock, the printing press, so many things, the abacus, but also proud of the contributions of America to modern society in terms of innovation and science and democracy, freedom, and the notions of equality, which have enabled people from all walks of life from around the world, including from China, to come to America in pursuit of that American dream of freedom, hope, and opportunity. And so while I'm proud of my Chinese ancestry and the contributions of China over thousands of years, I am an American, and I'm proud to be an American and proud of what America stands for.
And I think we all need to recognize that as great as this country is, and the entrepreneurism, the freedoms, and so forth, nothing. And I think basically one of the messages here is we all have an obligation to our children and grandchildren to put some measure of effort into trying to help protect the freedoms and the way of life here. Because if we don't, right, forces will defeat us, right? So please be, you know, please be active. It's very, very important. Well, I want to end by saying, Gary, it has been a great pleasure to have this fireside chat with you. I also want to say that whatever you pursue, if it involves getting help, raising money or support, you know, give me a call. I'll be there. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience. I hope this has been helpful to you in terms of this overall question about Asian American career ceilings. And we really encourage all of you that if there ever was a time that was important for all of us to be involved in government, whether it's elective or appointed or otherwise, this is an important time. And I think that's essentially part of the message, right, Gary, that you're saying, right?
Yep. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for hosting this and moderating, and hope we were able to touch upon the questions that many of the members in the audience had. And thank you to the Committee of 100 and the many other organizations that are active and that are part of this webcast. And keep up the great work. This is Asian American Pacific Islander Month, Heritage Month, and we have much to be proud of, much to celebrate. And let's go out and continue to take care of our communities and watch out for each other. Keep safe, keep those distances, wash those hands, and wear those masks whenever you're outside.
Yeah, and remember, May 16th, the commemoration of IMPay at 1 o'clock. We'll send invitations to everyone who is registered for this. May 27th, focus on legal and investment banking investing, but particularly pioneers and lessons learned by Asian American women. So thank you all, and thank you, Gary.
Thank you.